There are moments in myth where time does not move forward. It spirals, it circles, it holds its breath, it waits for something heavy enough to pull the story inward like gravity. One such moment, quiet, terrible, sacred, hangs at the center of all Norse stories. It is not marked by battle, not by fire or frost, but by a single rope, a silent scream, and the unbearable stillness of sacrifice. In the cold stillness beneath the world tree, there was once a man who called himself God. Not because he ruled the sky, or conquered nations, or basked in the worship of trembling mortals, but because he dared to suffer for something no other being had ever reached for. The hidden language beneath the world, the script of fate, the shape of truth. Odin had already tasted the outer edge of wisdom. He had wandered far beyond the gilded gates of Asgard, beyond the mountain halls and starlit feasts. He had stood at the edge of Mimir's well, where memory coils through the dark like a serpent, and given up his eye for a sip of knowing. That was not an act of vanity. It was desperation, devotion, an offering not of show, but of soul. But it wasn't enough. There were deeper truths, darker symbols, runes that did not rest on scrolls or stone, but lived inside the marrow of reality. They were not read, they were felt, pulled from pain, from patience, from the silence beyond silence. They did not reveal themselves to the curious, only to the broken. And so Odin broke himself, not in madness, not in punishment, but in invocation. He turned his back on Asgard's throne, left the halls of gold, walked away from the spears and songs and splendor. Alone, he wandered into the shadow of the tree that binds the 9 realms. Yggdrasil, spine of the cosmos, cradle of time, the ash tree whose roots drink from fate itself. Beneath its branches, he would give what no one else dared to give. Not a promise, not a prayer, but his entire being. He raised his spear, Gungnir, the weapon that never missed, the symbol of his will, and he turned it inward, into his side, into the space between breath and blood, and then he hanged. For 9 nights, he swung between life and death, suspended by the neck, pierced by his own hand. No food passed his lips, no drink touched his tongue, no voice answered his silence, no aid was allowed, not even from Frigg, his queen, not even from the gods who revered him. Only wind, only whisper, only the creaking of a rope on bark, and the brittle hush of bark splitting under the weight of a god's devotion. The nights were not counted in stars, but in visions, in dreams that tasted like blood and felt like fire. The tree held him, not kindly, not cruelly, but with the gravity of necessity. It was not death that awaited him. Death had no place here. It was change, revelation, the cracking open of the self, a descent into the underlayer of all things. The runes stirred, not in ink, not in carvings, but in him, as if they had waited eons for someone to come not with a question, but with a sacrifice. This is not the story of a king, not of a war, not of a victory written in banners. This is the story of the price of wisdom, of the scream that split silence and taught the world a new language, of the god who chose the noose, and in doing so, rewrote fate. This is Odin, hanged, not to die, but to know. Yggdrasil, the great ash tree, not a tree as mortals know them, but the spine of the universe, a living axis that binds the 9 realms, bridges the known and unknown, and cradles the structure of existence. Its roots do not simply dig, they drink. They draw from time itself, pulling secrets from the dawn of creation and anchoring them in the present. Its branches do not merely spread, they stretch across dimensions, into Asgard, where the gods rule in gold, wreathed in power and prophecy, into Alfheim, land of light and song, where elves craft starlight into blade and verse, into Vanaheim, where magic and nature twine like ivy, and the air hums with ancient songs. Its trunk casts a shadow over Midgard, the realm of men. There, the stories of gods become whispers, myths half remembered and half feared. Mortals plant seeds near sacred groves, not knowing why they bow their heads. Its bark bears the marks of eons, scorched by fire giants, scarred by frostbite older than winter itself, and inscribed with runes no mortal tongue can speak aloud without trembling. And deep below, far past the breath of Niflheim and the hollow stillness of Helheim, Yggdrasil's roots claw into the abyss. It is there, where time forgets itself and the stars blink slower, that three ancient wells shimmer in the dark like the eyes of sleeping titans. First, the well of Urd, the pool of fate. Here dwell the Norns, Urd, Verdandi, and Skuld, guardians of time's flow. They sit in ageless silence, spinning the threads of every life, every moment, every echo. They do not speak warnings. They do not celebrate births. They do not mourn deaths. They simply weave. Threads of light and shadow pass through their fingers, some coarse, some silk, all fragile. When they cut a thread, the world shifts. When they tie a knot, history is born. Second, the well of Mimir, a spring buried in frost-rimmed rock. From it flows memory, pure and unbroken. It is guarded by a severed head, Mimir himself, advisor to gods, keeper of the unknown, still sentient, still seeing. Odin came here once, not with pride, but with desperation. He offered his eye, not in tribute, but in exchange. He drank, and for a heartbeat that stretched into eternity, he glimpsed everything. Patterns behind prophecy, the song behind silence. That sight burned into him. Not because of what it showed, but because it left him forever aware of what remained hidden. Third, the well of Hvergelmir, the primal origin, a chaotic chasm from which the Elevaga rivers burst, raging with heat and potential. This is no peaceful sanctuary. It is the pulse of unformed creation. From Hvergelmir, all waters once flowed, and from its endless churn came ice and flame, life and entropy. The roots of Yggdrasil plunge into it, not for sustenance alone, but to draw in the raw, unshaped essence of what could be. These wells are not metaphors. They are the nervous system of reality. They are not worshipped, they are obeyed. If the cosmos has blood, it pulses through these depths. If it has thought, it dreams in their currents. And Odin stood before them, not as a god, but as a soul in turmoil, a seeker without rest, a ruler who knew that rulership was a mask without knowledge beneath it. It was here, beneath these roots, in the heavy hush between heartbeat and breath, that Odin first felt them, the runes, not symbols carved in wood or etched in stone. No, these were older, raw. They shimmered in the dark like fireflies trapped in amber. They sang in tones too low for ears. They moved behind the eyes. They were the source of language, of sorcery, of destiny. They shaped the law of becoming. They whispered, not words, but intentions, not answers, but riddles that could only be solved through surrender. They were not taught, they were earned, and they would not offer themselves to the curious, only to the broken, only to the one who dared to unmake himself. Mimir's wisdom had cracked something open in Odin, not a door, but a wound that wept questions, that gnawed at the edges of sleep, that whispered, always whispered, of what still lay hidden. And so he returned to the roots, again and again, sitting in silence, tracing the glyphs on bark with his breath, watching the surface of the wells, hoping for patterns, waiting for signs. Sometimes he thought he saw them. Sometimes they vanished the moment he looked too closely, until he understood. The runes would not come to him. He would have to descend. He would have to fall, not in battle, not in shame, but in offering. And that path would not be walked. It would be endured. It would be hung. The runes were waiting. They were waiting for pain. They were waiting for a sacrifice. There comes a moment, even for gods, when questions weigh more than crowns, when the throne becomes a burden and silence louder than any counsel. Odin had ruled, had battled, had conquered, but he had not yet known, not truly, not deeply. Not in the way that transforms the marrow of thought into the seed of something greater. Not in the way that leaves a god changed, stripped of every illusion of mastery. He had seen the runes, felt their pulse beneath bark and bone. He had traced their shapes in the veins of dreams and the frost on Mimir's well. But their meanings eluded him, just out of reach, like breath in the cold. They haunted him, woke him from sleep, pressed themselves into his thoughts like fingerprints in clay. He dreamed in riddles. He wept without tears. He asked questions to the wind, knowing there would be no reply. So he returned, again and again, always alone, each time drawn closer to Yggdrasil's trunk, each time staying longer, each time speaking less. Words became too small for what he sought. Even silence began to feel loud. Even prayer seemed too shallow. Until one day, he came not to visit, but to stay. He brought no army, no prayers, no offerings of gold or flame, only a rope and his spear, nothing more, nothing less, the bare bones of resolve. The decision was not sudden. It had festered, slowly, steadily, like a splinter in the soul, a whisper that became a wound, the knowledge that the runes would not yield to sight alone. That wisdom could not be bargained for, only bled for. That the cost of knowing was everything that made him comfortable, powerful, proud. That even divinity must bow to the laws of sacrifice. He walked beneath the tree, not like a king, but like a shadow shedding its body, a god unmaking himself. The leaves above him seemed to darken. The air grew colder, the roots curled tighter around the soil. He raised Gungnir, his own weapon, forged in the heart of cosmic fire, and drove it into himself. A god pierced by his own intent. No hand guided him, no ritual blessed him. He was the blade and the wound, the right and the ruin, the executioner and the offering. He climbed the world tree alone. No gods followed, no voices called after. Only the creak of ancient bark beneath boot, the hush of a world watching without breath. He ascended through silence, through vision, through memory. Each branch carried echoes, of war cries, of lullabies, of things that once were, but now were only lessons. Each knot in the bark held an old promise. Each gust of wind carried forgotten names. And then, the rope, tightened by his own hand, slipped over the branch that held the heavens, and he dropped. 9 nights he hung, no food, no drink, no relief. Time did not pass, it twisted. The stars moved like hunters circling prey. The wind howled without end. Each breath scraped like rusted glass. The pain was not constant, it evolved. It deepened, it rewrote his senses. And yet he did not scream. Not in pain, but in awakening. The suffering became a song, a dirge, a drumbeat echoing down the spine of the tree. He saw visions, not of glory, not of gods, but of endings, of blood on snow, of ash falling where cities once stood, of wolves howling beneath shattered moons. He saw his own face in shadows, his own death reflected in mirrors of ice. He saw the tree burn, he saw the world drown. He saw the gods kneeling before truths they could not name, but he also saw patterns, hidden behind the scream, spirals in darkness, shapes in flame, letters formed from breath and bone, runes rising from his suffering like embers from a funeral pyre. They moved with intent. They gathered like storm clouds. Each rune came with a cost, a memory lost, a name forgotten, a fear faced. They arrived like blades drawn from a wound, sharp, burning, but holy. Some sang, some screamed. All carved something into him that could never be erased. The runes were not gifts. They were ordeals. Each one a trial, each one a blade, each one a mirror held too close. Some brought clarity, others madness. All brought change. And change is the only true price of insight. And with every moment on that rope, Odin did not fade. He became the bridge between what is and what might be. The whisper between breath and word, the architect of thought, the father of insight, the patron of those who would risk everything to learn what cannot be taught. He became the scar that speaks, the silence that instructs, the death that does not end. His eye was already gone, but now he lost the rest of himself, piece by piece, until only the seeker remained, until the man who had been king was replaced by the god who had paid the price, until wisdom etched itself into every bone, every breath, every shadow of his being. When he finally fell from the tree, it was not a collapse. It was a return, a birth. The ground did not receive him as broken. It received him as changed. The winds shifted, the bark whispered, the roots remembered, and the runes, now burned into his mind, his bones, his breath, they were his, not to keep, but to give, to shape, to speak, to protect and to destroy, to build and to banish. This was no miracle. This was the consequence of sacrifice. This was the seeker's descent. When Odin fell, the world did not cheer. There was no thunderclap, no divine trumpet, no chorus of gods to welcome his return. Only the whisper of leaves and the breath of something ancient shifting beneath the roots. A moment of stillness, dense and immeasurable, as if the tree itself had stopped breathing. He did not awaken like a man from sleep, but like a mountain from stone, slow, unyielding, transformed. The pain remained, the scars remained. But something else had arrived too, something larger than language, deeper than memory, something that throbbed in his blood and hummed in his bones, a presence that did not speak with voice or vision, but with truth, immutable, eternal. The runes had entered him, not as knowledge, but as transformation. They did not whisper truths. They were truths. Patterns older than stars, scripts older than time. They shimmered across the back of his mind like constellations in thought, neither read nor written, only felt. Each rune was not a letter, but a force, a law, a fragment of the original architecture of existence. They carved pathways through his awareness, linking concept to consequence, breath to becoming. They moved inside him now, danced on the backs of his eyelids when he closed his eyes, stirred beneath his skin when he spoke. They were not his to command, but they had chosen to dwell in him, and that changed everything. He was no longer a seeker. He was the threshold. He had not merely survived. He had been altered, forged. As iron is forged in fire, as stone is weathered by the ages. Each breath he drew now resonated with unseen geometry. The first rune taught him that sound creates, that names are not labels, but levers. To name a thing is to hold part of its essence. To speak a name is to shape its direction. The second rune taught him that breath is spellwork, that every sigh, every chant, every curse and lullaby carries weight in the weave of the world. That language is not just communication, it is creation. The third rune showed him the shape of sacrifice. That power flows not from taking, but from giving what cannot be reclaimed. That true might is forged in the fire of surrender. And still they came. A tide of understanding that moved too slowly to be rushed, too sacred to be spoken aloud. Each rune a trial, a vision, a wound that taught. The runes showed Odin the bones beneath the myth, the currents beneath time, the threads that the Norns weave and the knots they fear to tie. They showed him where thought became form, where fate braided itself into law. And more than that, they gave him burden. For to hold this power was to become part of the engine, to pull the levers, twist the gears, and accept the consequences. To act with the knowledge that every word cast a shadow. He saw now that fate was not fixed. That destiny was not a single thread, but a loom of infinite branches, spun in secret and shadow. Some paths bright, others blackened by grief, all trembling with potential. And with the runes, he could touch them. He could speak not just of fate, but to it. He could bend the arc, redirect the river. He could shape it. But shaping fate meant shaping the end. For every path illuminated, another dimmed. For every destiny shifted, another sealed. He saw Ragnarok, not as prophecy, but as potential. A crack in the foundation that might be widened or sealed. A fire that could burn or forge. Not doom, but decision. He saw the death of gods, the rise of new ones, the howl of Fenrir, the serpent that circles the world biting its own tail. He saw his own body on the battlefield. He saw his name sung in ash and silence. He saw the world reset or reborn, but he did not turn away, because the runes had not given him escape. They had given him clarity, and with clarity came command. He stood, slowly. The ravens watched. The tree behind him stood silent, and the runes pulsed once, faintly, as if to say, "Now you know." He would return to Asgard not as a king, but as a keeper of words that shape worlds, a keeper of names that carve meaning into silence, a keeper of knowledge that wounds as it heals, that saves only through struggle, a god who had paid the price. And from that moment on, Odin would no longer be just the Allfather. He would be the Rune Master, the whisperer of fate, the god who hung for knowledge and brought it back like fire stolen from the void, a living bridge between suffering and truth. The world would never be the same, because one god dared to ask the question and bleed for the answer, because one god chose knowledge over comfort, cost over certainty, pain over pride. This was no vision. This was no myth. This was the revelation of the runes. When Odin returned, Asgard did not rejoice. No horns were sounded. No feasts were prepared. There were no garlands, no songs. For something in him had shifted, profoundly, irreversibly. He came not as the victor of battle, but as one who had endured something greater than war. He did not march. He did not declare. He simply walked, and the world around him changed. The gods saw it in his silence, in the way he looked not at them, but through them, as if their forms were reflections, and he now saw the source. He walked among them, but was no longer of them. He had touched something older than divinity, and the echo of that contact lingered in his gaze. Even the halls he once called home felt unfamiliar. Shadows deeper, colors more brittle, laughter more distant. He spoke little, but when he did, his words carried gravity. Not just weight, but force. His voice now bent the air, carved meaning where none had existed. Each sentence felt like prophecy, each pause like a page turning in the book of fate. His speech was not loud, but every syllable bore the rhythm of thunder wrapped in thought. The runes lived in him, and through him they began to shape the world. Not through spectacle, but through subtlety, through wisdom that spread like roots, unseen but inescapable. He no longer ruled with decree. He ruled with insight. He did not hoard this power. He spread it, carefully, deliberately, to those few whose hearts could bear the heat of truth. Seers, shamans, poets, warriors who understood that the true blade is shaped in thought before metal. He taught them not what the runes meant, but how to listen, how to receive truth without drowning in it, how to wield knowledge without being consumed. The skalds began to sing in new rhythms. The Volvas dreamed deeper. The berserkers no longer charged blindly, but bore symbols on their tongues that bent the chaos around them. Magic was no longer merely incantation. It was insight made flesh. Words carried weight. Thought became talisman. Silence became sanctuary. Odin became a god of paradox, of wisdom and war, of poetry and prophecy, of death and revelation. The god who offered no comfort, but clarity, who promised no peace, but the fire that makes peace possible. He was the storm and the stillness after it, the riddle and the answer behind it, the wound and the lesson it carved. He walked both paths now, the ruler and the wanderer, the king and the sacrifice. His throne in Asgard was matched only by his footprints across the realms. He wore the crown, but he also wore the dust of foreign roads. Every village he passed, every fire he sat beside, added a verse to the great song of his becoming. in the laughter of strangers, in the questions of children, in the silence of mountains. He listened and he learned. He became the patron of those who search, of those who dare, of those who choose to know rather than believe, of scholars who burn their books to write their own, of lovers who speak truth in the dark, of leaders who admit they do not yet understand. And with every tale told in his name, with every rune carved into stone or spirit, the echo of that sacrifice lived on, in rituals whispered beside hearths, in oaths sworn beneath moonlight, in blood spilled for truth, in moments where courage overcame comfort and curiosity crushed fear. Because what Odin brought back was not treasure, it was template, not power, but permission, to risk, to fall, to rise transformed, to remake oneself in the image of insight rather than inheritance. This was not a myth. It was a blueprint for transformation, for courage, for the relentless pursuit of meaning in a world that so often hides it, for breaking oneself open to make room for wisdom. And it was only the beginning, for the runes still whisper, in dreams, in storms, in quiet moments when the soul leans forward, for the tree still waits, ancient, patient, hungry for truth, offering not comfort, but clarity. And the next seeker may not be divine, but may still be worthy to ask, to bleed, to know. Because the legacy of Odin is not a crown, it is a question, carved in pain. Will you dare to hang? There are stories told of gods who ruled with thunder, with blade, with fear. But Odin's greatest act was none of these. It was not conquest. It was not command. It was not domination nor triumph over enemies. It was surrender, a surrender so absolute that it unraveled him, a giving so total that it rewrote what a god could be. Not the kind of surrender that ends with defeat, but the kind that begins with awakening. He did not surrender in weakness. He surrendered in will. He did not fall. He descended into himself, into the roots of truth, into the marrow of the cosmos. He stripped away every divine comfort, every illusion of control, until only the question remained. And when he faced it, fully, naked, wounded, it answered not with words, but with transformation. He was not worshipped because he was perfect. He was worshipped because he dared to be broken, to be uncertain, to bleed for what could never be fully held, to fall not in failure, but in pursuit. Because in that breaking, he became the bridge between divine and mortal, the link between the unreachable and the seeking, between the crown and the root, between creation and the price it demands. His sacrifice was not an ending, it was a beginning of a new kind of divinity, one not built on dominance, but on depth, not on certainty, but on seeking, not on supremacy, but surrender. He became the god of process, of paradox, of patience. And every beginning that follows, every question whispered into the dark, every truth pulled from silence, bears his mark. The moment the first rune was spoken from a scarred mouth, the first dream reshaped by vision, the first song that wept while it taught, the first wound that taught more than it bled, they bear his fingerprints. He is the God who gave everything, not for power, but for meaning, not to reign, but to understand, not to be feared, but to be followed, not in worship, but in willingness, and to leave behind not a temple, but a path lined with silence, carved by struggle, lit by runes, a path not for gods, but for seekers, for those who would sacrifice comfort for clarity, for those who would trade control for curiosity, for those willing to descend, not to die, but to become. And perhaps in a world that asks us to shout, to win, to conquer, Odin's tale is a whisper reminding us that knowledge is earned, that truth is not safe, That becoming something more begins with letting go of what we are. Not once, but again and again, over lifetimes, over losses, over quiet moments of decision no one else sees. So if something stirred in you, a fracture, a flicker, a fire, know this: it is not the end. It is the door. It is the call to choose differently, to seek, to question, to descend. The runes are still speaking. The roots are still listening. The gods are still watching. And no matter who you are or what gods you follow, there is always one truth waiting beneath it all. Every act of becoming requires a cost, but only those willing to pay it will ever shape the world. If this story moved you, let the runes echo further. Like, comment with what you're seeking, and subscribe to follow the path of the myth. The journey is far from over.